Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Searching for Dragons. I'm Snappy, and I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Graham. How's it going, Graham?
I'm good. How are you?
Wonderful, wonderful. And this is Searching for Dragons. So this is the show where we do deep dives into artists from across history who engage with life and art through magic and in a magical practice. And we like to remind everyone sort of like our quintessential dragon is like Antonin Artaud. We've also talked about in the past Madison Cawein, as well as Leconte de l'Autrement or Isidore Ducasse. And these are kind of the people we're looking for, people who really invigorate their lives and their art through magical practice. So today, I'm going to be showing Graham, as well as all of you, my personal favorite poet of all time, H.D. Hilda Doolittle. Pretty cool, eh, Graham?
I'm excited.
Right. So the idea, Hilda Doolittle is a really interesting figure because when I was looking into her, like I first heard about her in university taking a women's studies class. And I didn't learn about her as a poet first. I learned about her through her life and through her radical feminism and kind of like the person she was in history. And she's kind of been very, very celebrated for that. And a lot of her poetry, unfortunately, has kind of been like neglected or less talked about outside of like academia and whatnot. But she's a really interesting figure because she plays like such an important role in several different artistic moments and movements at the turn of the century and across the world wars. So she's one of the founding figures of both modernism as well as what later becomes known as the imagist poetry movement, and also plays a role in radical feminism and in psychoanalysis. So it's kind of a really interesting person. Had you heard about HD or anything before I had mentioned her to you, Graham?
I don't remember where I heard the name before, just across reading about influence, like artists will mention influences and stuff. And then like I heard the name mentioned, but never looked into her life or her work.
For sure. And had you ever heard of imagism or imagist poetry before?
I had not.
That's kind of interesting to me because you as a person, you always tell me about how much you like that idea of rejecting a form and kind of simplicity and rawness of emotion. And that's kind of like the imagist's whole bag.
Well, I'm excited then. Yeah, I never like studied poetry really in university or like read a lot about like poetry history. I just discover artists that I like and then read about their lives a bit and their work and then jump
And I
into
totally respect that. That honestly is how I've discovered 99% of poetry, right? Like this is one of the few exceptions. And again, it wasn't even from an English class. It was from a women's studies class, So it's very interesting. So let's get into it here. We're going to start with, I got a little presentation. I mean, we're probably going to go a bit long today because Hilda Doolittle lived such an incredible kind of radical life for her time and place, and is such a interesting figure. So
we have
she
to
was
give her
born. Yeah, we got to give her credit, and really get into it. And if you feel you want to comment, just interrupt me at any time, Graham. So
Okay.
This is what she looks like at like 22. This is kind of like her classic image, is how most of the books show her and whatnot. So I wanted to show that right at the start. But Hilda was born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1886. She had 3 brothers and 2 older half-brothers. And her father, Charles, was a mathematician and an astronomer, and her mother was a painter. And she was born into like an ultra-religious, ultra-Orthodox community of Moravian Christians, which is kind of interesting. So her dad actually was, he worked at this particular place here, which was called the Sayre Observatory. And he was a professor of math at Leahy University. And early on, he was kind of a very different from a lot of people in her community because he believed in the education of women, and he believed in education as like extraordinarily important. So from a very young age, he gave what would have been considered to Hilda a men's education. And he trained her in math and in literature and had her go to private schooling throughout her early childhood, which was kind of unheard of at the time. And, you know, the Moravian community is really interesting because they're kind of like a radical sect of Protestantism that comes from like the 1600s in Moravia, which is a province of Bohemia, now modern day Czech Republic. And a lot of them en masse immigrated to the US, and they have a very interesting kind of direct sort of connection with deity in their spirituality. Like they would be doing a lot of like speaking in tongues. Hilda talks about in her early life seeing a lot of people staying up and praying all night. And like radically famously, the Moravians back in Bohemia, they maintained a constant vigil of prayer for over 100 years, you know, and they didn't have monks, these people, because they, you know, they're radical Protestants. So they didn't believe in abandoning and not living a family lifestyle. But this kind of Christianity really deeply impacted her. And it gave her like that direct perception of religion. And she even talked about speaking in tongues from a young age and being possessed by the Holy Spirit and having these engagements. And also being a part of like such a strict religious minority really made her an outcast amongst her peers at this time, you know? And also she went to private school and whatnot. So she always felt kind of separate from the greater American community too. So I wanted to show these two pictures. So on the left, this is Hilda at the age of 15, okay? And on her right here is a really famous poet, Ezra Pound. And together, these two kind of play, like they have a really long, tumultuous relationship over the course of their lives, and they deeply impact each other. Meeting at such a young age, they kind of like fell over heels in love with one another. And they became kind of like pen pals at this time and encouraged each other in poetry. There's actually a collection of love poems that Ezra wrote to Hilda. And Ezra actually considered Hilda his muse for most of this period of his life. And what ends up happening, like they meet in Philadelphia, but Ezra is such a driven, kind of powerful figure. He wants to study English and he's determined. He decides he's going to Penn State. And Hilda, determined to follow him, enrolls in this really intense women's college called, and here's the women's college here, it's called Bryn Mawr, and it's part of Penn State. But at this time, this would have been like high academics for women, you know? And she was studying English and mathematics, okay? And this is all taking place like in around like 1905. At this time, she starts like, her and Pound, they form a sexual relationship, and they even get secretly engaged behind her parents' backs because Hilda's parents were devout Moravians and they did not approve of Pound. They thought Pound was like a, you know, a bit of a crazy person and a young, rambunctious, and not religious enough for their taste. But Hilda didn't care. She got secretly engaged to him anyways. And at this time, while they're studying, what ends up happening is Ezra becomes really involved in art and decides that he's going to take off. And he first goes to New York to pursue poetry, and eventually gets an opportunity to go to London to pursue poetry. And they're still writing letters at this time between each other, and they're maintaining their kind of their engagement, but they're very young. We're talking 16, 17, you know? So it's kind of a crazy time in both of their lives. Ezra Pound is really influenced at this time, especially by the time he gets to New York, by a lot of the spiritualist movement that was happening at the time. And he actually sends this book to Hilda Doolittle. It's called The 14 Lessons in Yogi Philosophy by Yogi Ramacharaka. Now, this is actually a pseudonym. This was written by an American guy who was pretending to be a famous yogi. And he had done this like several times. I'm trying to remember this guy's name. Oh, shoot. I forgot to write it. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But this was kind of her first introduction to a lot of occultism and radical philosophy, and it really kind of impacted her in how she thought. So at the same time, while she's reading all of this philosophy, she's failing in university. While Ezra Pound is succeeding and he's decided to abandon his studies and take off, she's really, really deeply struggling. And at this time, she decides to also quit university, and she abandons studying English in university and math because she just kept failing, which is kind of interesting because she goes on to become an English prose writer, but
be as different than practicing writing, right?
That's very true. There's something about when you're pursuing something through passion, rather than studies. And I imagine trying to study it at a college would be really hard. But what's interesting about her, she doesn't abandon her studies at this time. Instead, she takes up the personal study of Greek and Latin. Okay. And this is inspired a lot by this Ramacharaka, as well as her occult talks and talks of magic and mythology with Ezra Pound. And she becomes really deeply enamored with Greek philosophy. And this becomes a lifelong passion of hers. And she's like an autodidactic learner and teaches herself to become fluent in both the Latin and the Greek, to such an extent that later on in her life, she becomes a professional translator and works as such in England. So in 1908, Ezra Pound takes off and he goes to London. And at the same time, Hilda starts having a romantic relationship with a woman, this woman named Frances Gregg. And she falls head over heels for her. She's still kind of like connected to Pound, but at the same time, she's not sure. Pound is off pursuing all of this art and has gone to England and is kind of out of her reach. But she's also encouraging him to be an artist, right? So there's still this love connection, but it's kind of separating. And she's now discovering this other side of herself and her bisexuality and this deep attraction to women. And at this time, her and Greg decide to, and as well as Hilda's mother, they take a trip to England. And they arrive in 1910. And when they get to England, they find out that Ezra Pound is actually secretly engaged to another woman. He's become engaged to this woman, Dorothy Shakespeare. And rather than get like deeply upset by this, Hilda's kind of relieved.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense.
Right? And they have a deep talk about this. And she decides to stay in London to pursue art. And Greg and her mother return back to America. So this is about 1911 when she goes to London. So here's a photo of a flat that she lived later on with her husband in London, her husband, Richard Aldington, which I'll get to. But I just wanted to show this because it was a cool shot of a place that she actually lived.
Yeah.
And this is, so while in London, she starts to really get involved in the poetry scene and starts to mingle with Ezra Pound and all of his poetry connections. And Ezra Pound has kind of inserted himself into like the high art of the London world. And he's such a salesman and a popular figure and just this radical force of personality that he kind of makes everyone pay attention to him. And he becomes friends with everyone. He's friends with T.S. Eliot, with William Butler Yeats, Ernest Hemingway. All of these figures all know him and want to work with him. And at the same time, sorry, go ahead.
No, nothing.
And Richard Aldington is in this kind of core crew. And HD winds up falling madly in love with Aldington. And they wind up getting married. And also at the same time, Ezra Pound starts publishing and working, and he has put together with some of his literary friends the first popular poetry magazine ever put to print. And at this time, Hilda starts to experiment with really short verse. and really limited phrase. And she becomes obsessed with this idea of the image, right? And she relates it to this Greek concept of the eidolon and this perception of deity. So she becomes obsessed with this idea of turning her poems into a perfect sensory visualization of like an image or of deity. And this like deeply, deeply impacts Pound. He's like totally amazed by this. And being the kind of salesman and radical he is, and he kind of sees HD doing this and is like, you know what? She isn't called HD at this point. She's still Hilda Doolittle. He's like, I know I'm going to sell you. I know how to make you popular in the current London art world. We're going to transform everything. Your ideas on poetry are so transformative. We're going to work together and create a whole new movement. So he gives her the moniker HD and says, if you're going to make your poetry really simple, you got to make your name really simple. And you tell me your poems are all about the image. Well, modernism, which we're kind of a part of, this is the big movement at the time in London. And it originally comes from France. So everything French is super, super popular at this time, you know, and is seen as the most progressive and the most future forward kind of ideas. So he's like, if you're all about the image, let's call you the imagist. And he spells it with an E on the end, and an, you know, so it's in the French. So she becomes HD imagist. And he has her poetry published in the first issue of Poetry Magazine here. So really kind of interesting. And like this, HD loves this, but at the same time is deeply, deeply troubled by this. You know, she agrees to do it because Pound is such a profound figure and can get her published, can get her noticed. But at the same time, she's very like, she writes a lot in her memoirs about her own mother. And she felt like her own mother sacrificed her artistic pursuits to become a housewife and to be in for her father's dreams. And she's afraid that Pound is trying to do the same thing to her. She feels like she's being transformed into Pound's muse, you know? So she's desperate at this time to also kind of make a name for herself. So why she agrees to it, there is a bit of like pushback here. But later on, as this keeps going, basically Richard Aldington and Pound and Hilda all together, they form what they call the three core like ideas of the imagist art movement. And this is how they view their poetry. So the number one rule is direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. 2, to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. And 3, as regarding rhythm, to compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in the sequence of the metronome. So they get rid of all of the rhymes, all of the music, like they keep a certain musicality, but it's not one that's based on beats.
Yeah, pentameter and diameter and stuff like that.
Exactly. So I'm going to show you now what's considered to be one of her first imagist poems. It's called O Reed. It's called O Reed or O Red. And for those of us who study mythology, you'll recognize that O Red is a type of nymph in the Greek mythology. These are nymphs of the mountains. So it says, whirl up, sea, whirl your pointed pines, splash your great pines on our rocks, hurl your green over us, cover us with your pools of fur.
I love it.
Can you see the image?
Definitely.
You know, like when I look at this, I see the mountain getting beaten by the waves, you know, and it's the waves that fuel and connect the mountain. And this is really deeply profound for HD because she considered herself a devout follower of the Great Mother, the Mother Goddess. And she really felt like many of the female characters within Greek mythology were connected to one another. And she saw them as representative fundamentally as the seas and the oceans. So this image of water comes up a lot in her poetry. And anytime you see it, it's always the great goddess, you know?
And you see the image of a wave in the typography of the way the lines are set up also.
Exactly. And that's all purposeful, right? Everything
Yeah.
does, right? And when you get into this kind of poetry, every word, every grammatical thing, even if there's mistakes, they're all intended, right? So this is kind of where they're at this point in like, so this is all taking place around 1912 is when Ezra Pound gives HD her moniker, and by 1913 she gets married to Richard Aldington, who's considered, like, the three of them are considered the founders of the imagist movement and the most important poets of that particular movement at this time. And then in 1914, just before the start of World War I, Ezra Pound publishes this book called Des Imagistes, and it contains 14 poets, including Aldington and HD. You know, and he saw it like his duty was to promote HD beyond all else, because he saw her as like his muse and as this transformative force for bringing this simplistic, image-driven poetry to the world. You know,
Right.
But 1914 is a very tumultuous time, right? Because it's also the start of World War I, and HD and Ezra Pound are both expatriates living in London at this time. So it's kind of a scary place even for them to be living. And what winds up happening is that Aldington joins the war, and he gets sent to go fight on the front lines. And prior to joining the front line, he had been promoted to the assistant editor of another magazine that was connected to the imagist movement called The Egoist, an individualist review. Now, this is a really cool publication because originally it comes out of the women's suffragette movement. And it was originally called The Free Woman. But this imagist movement at the time was seen as so radically progressive, and people wanted to connect to it, that a lot of these women identified with the movement, and they transformed their paper into something that would promote imagism and this individuality. So they started to move beyond just feminism and into this radical sense of self, you know, and taking back the self as like an idea. And this was like, I know a lot of us look at egoism as like a bad thing, but you got to remember, coming out of World War I, you know, like, people weren't allowed to have opinions, especially if you were working class. You know, people weren't allowed to dress however they wanted. Women were regulated to the home, you know, and like a gay woman, or at least a bisexual woman like HD, and openly so, this was unheard of, you know. So really, really interesting. So when Aldington gets drafted to the front line, HD takes over for a couple years as the assistant editor for this magazine. And Ezra Pound was also the assistant editor at one point. But also around this time, she manages at the end of 1914, she publishes her first book, which is called The Sea Garden. And this contains a lot of her early imagist poetry, as well as some early poems regarding various feminine figures from Greek mythology, which would become like a very prominent theme throughout her work. And it's her first collection. And it was pretty well received, but it didn't sell as well as any of the imagists hoped at the time. And a lot of this has to do with the war. You know, the war kind of really upset everything. So she also, by the end of 1914, she winds up, I'll leave it here for now. By the end of 1914, beginning of 1915, she winds up having a miscarriage of Richard Aldington's child. And she attributes this due to stress of the war, specifically hearing of the destruction of the Lusitania ship, and just unable to deal with all of the chaos that was happening in her life. And by 1916, her husband winds up coming back home, but he's sort of deeply shell-shocked. You know, he's really suffering from PTSD and is unable to be close to HD or relate to her. And she's also dealing with all of this intense emotion after having lost her child. So they become really, really, really distant at this time. Okay. And as the war is winding down, everyone starts to become more and more radicalized and kind of crazy. Okay. So we've been talking about Ezra Pound, right? Who saw HD as his muse and was this radical figure at the center of poetry in London at this time. And he's kind of like, he had positioned himself as sort of like the king of the imagist movement and would dictate to everyone, no, this is what it is. And we all have to follow these very strict, rigid formula. If you want to be part of our crew, you have to do this. And by this time, you know, HD is kind of done with imagism. She finds it way too restrictive. She wants to engage more with poetic language, and she is really engaged in translation at this time. And she starts writing a lot of palimpsests, you know, so she would translate works and then incorporate them into her own works, especially the poetry of Sappho, and as well as a lot of the great tragedies. Like she famously translates Iphigenia at this time.
Wow.
So this is what a paid job for her. So she's paid as a professional translator to go through Iphigenia, which is kind of cool, I thought.
Yeah.
Ezra Pound is becoming totally radicalized, and he's like, he's so intense by the end of near the end of World War I, he starts distancing himself from the inherent feminism that's within the imagist movement, and he starts delving a lot more into like nationalism and a lot of like these kind of pride politics, and he becomes really obsessed with this idea of bringing back the Holy Sacred Roman Empire, you know. And at the same time this is happening, right, imagism is not just a movement that's like located to London, right? It's having like far-reaching impact. And the lady on the left there, she's a really famous poet. Her name is Amy Lowell. And she is in America at the time and during World War I. And she starts writing in the style of imagism, okay? And she becomes by far the most successful imagist poet. She wins the Pulitzer Prize in poetry. Her books become national bestsellers. And she becomes really upset that Ezra Pound never included her in his Des Imagistes book. She wasn't one of the 14. And she becomes really mad that the movement is kind of so tightly knit in London. So she packs up her bags and moves to London because she wants to work with Pound and HD. But when she gets to London, she finds that HD is totally disillusioned, you know, with imagism and is focused on translation. And Pound has kind of gone off the total rails, you know. So she connects with a lot of the other imagist poets and becomes super celebrated, and they really respect her, especially the women in this moment. And Ezra just gets super upset. You know, he starts demanding that people follow him, that they conform to those 3 specific rules. He starts writing even more rules. And Amy is just like, no, I refuse. And a bunch of the imagists get together and they kick him out of the Egoist magazine. You know, they kick him out of Poetry magazine. They start their own kind of movement. So Ezra, in a fit of rage, he says that imagism has been reduced to Amy-gism, as in the masturbatory efforts of Amy alone. And he decides to like throw the whole movement away. And this really deeply impacts him. And he develops like this deep anger and resentment towards a lot of women at this time, and towards a lot of the movement that he had started. He gets involved in a lot of the more abstract art. And he winds up creating a whole new movement with some other artists called vorticism. And you can see some of the art there. And this is in the middle of the war that they're publishing this. So they're being extraordinarily provocative, calling it war number, blast. And
the art reminds me of a blend of like Escher meets futurism.
Right? It's so futurism is a huge influence because the main founder of futurism at this time is this guy named Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. Okay.
Yeah.
And Filippo, he gets involved in the vorticism movement with Ezra, but convinces Ezra to adopt fascism because vorticism doesn't go far enough. And at this time, like, he's coming to London with his futurism, but his futurism is already evolving into fascism by this time.
Yeah.
And he's famous because he writes he writes one of the first published works on what fascism is at this time, you know? And they're deeply connected to Mussolini, and both of them are deeply invested in this idea of rebuilding the Roman Empire and returning and bringing back that glory. And they feel that Mussolini will be able to do this. So it's you know, basically Ezra winds up alienating himself from all of his friends, from everyone in his life. And by the end of the war, he abandons London for Italy and actually becomes a propagandist for Mussolini and writes radio ads for him and writes anti-American stuff. And it's really, really quite crazy. The last time that HD would ever be published in a work by Ezra is this magazine, Blast. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was just saying that's such a wild turn of events, and what a trajectory, you know?
Right. It's so crazy, but it's important we understand that, like, Mussolini and the fascists at this time, right? People didn't really know. Like, I'm not defending nationalism or any of their ideas, but there was this kind of high art ideal that Mussolini really strived to project. And he really did attach himself to this, I'm going to bring back Rome, I'm going to make the world great again, kind of very MAGA, you know, that really appealed to a lot of these men, especially classicists and occultists, people like Ezra Pound, you know. So right. it's kind of a really sad thing, but it is what it is, you know.
Yeah.
At this time, you know, at near like in that period of like 1915 to about 1918, HD is involved in translation, and she winds up becoming deeply close friends with D.H. Lawrence, who's here on the left, another very famous modernist poet, and also becomes connected to this man here on the right, Cecil Gray, who's a composer and a musician. And she never winds up having an affair with DH, though they had like a very, very close relationship. She does write in her memoirs, it almost happens, but then Cecil showed up and she wound up jumping into bed with Cecil because she didn't, in her words, want to ruin DH's marriage. So she really was kind of suffering and was alone at this time because she couldn't connect to her husband, Aldington, who was suffering from PTSD. Right. She lost her child, gone through the war. You know, so she really needed to connect, and she found that love and connection in these two men. But what ends up happening is she gets pregnant in 1917. Sorry, she gets pregnant with Cecil Gray's child, and she tells Aldington, who at first is okay, and she goes ahead and decides she's going to have the child. But by the time she has the child, Aldington has divorced her, married another person, and doesn't want her to give her daughter Perdita Aldington's name. But HD, being HD, gives her Aldington's last name anyway. And kind of a radical craziness, but that's how it all went down. So she's kind of a single woman with a child at the end of 1917. And by 1918, she meets this woman, Bryher. Now, this is one of the most important figures in modern feminism and queer history, because Bryher is one of the first, like, very public, very documented non-binary people. Like, she never used that term because it didn't really exist, but it's very clear based upon her writings that that's how she identified. She personally called herself a lesbian, but she never identified with the female sex, and throughout her life would get her close personal friends to refer to her only by her name Bryher, which was a name that she took for herself based on one of the Scilly Isles, which are a set of islands off the coast of the UK that are really important to a lot of mythology, especially the Celtic mythology. And again, you see this kind of identification with the sea with these women, and this loving investment with this mythology and these goddesses. And Bryher was extraordinarily rich. So she comes from, at the time, trying to remember her family name. Anyway, she at the time, her father is the richest man in all of the UK. Okay, so she's the equivalent of a billionaire by today's standards, but she's a woman, you know, and a gay woman at this, right? Or a non-binary person, sorry. And they had such a hard time trying to like function and live at this early time. What Bryher winds up doing is they enter into a marriage of convenience with a publisher friend of theirs, Robert McAlmond. And this was because her father wouldn't allow her to have her own independence and her own finances. And for women at this time, legally, you needed to have a man, and she couldn't even inherit. So by the time her father does die, she has a husband of convenience and inherits a bunch of money and is able to live on their own. And what she starts to do, she becomes deeply involved in the imagist movement, which, as we talked about, was very welcoming to women, especially queer women. And she starts funding a lot of these people and becoming like a really important benefactor for the poetry movement. She starts a couple magazines. She funds a bunch of very famous artists at this time. And in 1918, she winds up meeting HD. And they fall madly in love with each other. And this becomes like a lifelong partnership, to the point where by 1919, Bryher adopts HD's daughter, Perdita, as her own and makes her legal heir to her fortune. And so this time, kind of before, like after the end of World War I and before World War II, is a really kind of relaxed time for HD and Bryher. They spend, and it's also a really tumultuous time. So by the end of the war, HD's youngest brother dies. He's killed in action. And this causes her father, Charles, to have a heart attack. And HD's mother then relocates to London to live with Bryher and HD. And the three of them start going on a lot of various trips. They famously go to the Isle of Lesbos. And so this is Bryher and HD, in later life. I just thought this was a really cute picture. There are very few pictures of them together, unfortunately. But so from about 1918 to 1920, they're traveling all around. They go to Corfu, Egypt. They go to Greece, specifically to Lesbos. They spend a long time on the Isle of Lesbos. And there, HD composes this collection of poetry, which is really kind of like where she starts to truly define herself. This is where her feminism comes to like a fore. And the title of the poem is called Hymen. And it's all about women, specifically famous women of mythology. And she writes all different kinds of poems. There's one of her most famous poems that comes out of this is called Circe, which we'll be going into later. She also writes another really famous poem on Helen, which Helen becomes her kind of like one of her muses. This is a figure that features predominantly in most of her art and is someone she deeply, deeply identified with throughout her life. So here's a picture of HD on the Isle of Lesbos on the beach, and this was taken by Bryher.
Lovely.
So by the end of this is another picture that Bryher, this is a book she wrote at this time, but never got published. This picture was taken by Bryher. It's called Hermione, and it's also of the same theme. So this was more of these female-centric mythological poems, but it didn't get published until after her death, because she felt that these poems were too deeply personal at the time to release. But by 1920, like by the late 1920s, you know, a lot of the HD becomes really heavily involved in psychoanalysis and in gender studies. She starts to read a lot and correspond with a bunch of different psychoanalysts to try and understand what was going on with her and her sexuality and Bryher's sexuality. And Bryher famously funded a lot of the early psychoanalysis movement. And they also get heavily involved in film at this time. And by 1929, they release the first magazine dedicated to film as an art form, which is called Close Up. And at this time, Bryher winds up divorcing Robert Almond, her marriage of convenience. And she winds up marrying this man here. And this man, just let me double check his name. Okay. What was his name? Kenneth McPherson. And Kenneth McPherson, he's an actor and a artist and a bisexual. And this is his lover here on the right, but he's also a lover of HD. And Bryher winds up marrying him, and they form kind of like a three-part trio. And Bryher also winds up sleeping with McPherson, but it's more of a Bryher describes it in her writing as a love of minds, not a love of bodies. And they still identified as lesbian, even though they had deep, intimate relations with McPherson. And they even thought that McPherson may have been feminine. At least that's how Bryher saw them. But this trio, they become a really powerful art group to themselves. And they form a movie collective called Pool by 1933. And they start releasing a bunch of films. And this is one of the only surviving films from the Pool group. It's called Borderline. And it stars HD, and it also has this man here. And this was extraordinarily progressive for the time because it dealt with racism and it deals with a lot of surrealist themes, which in the 30s, a lot of people were not talking about, especially in film. And
especially the surrealism by that point was still more confined to France.
Right.
Yeah.
And Spain and stuff. It's just starting to become popularized outside of mainland Europe, So she's really, these people are extraordinarily experimental and really on the cusp of high art at this time, So by the end of 1933, Bryher buys this mansion that they build in Art Deco style on the Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And also at this time, HD begins a deep friendship with psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. So she winds up in 1933 and 1944 actually traveling to Austria, and she works with Freud for a couple of years. And they become deep personal friends. And she winds up writing this book, Tribute to Freud, which I highly, highly recommend people read, because it really shows you how intense this kind of psychoanalysis was. And, Freud is kind of a marginalized figure by modern terms, but he's really deeply progressive, especially for when you consider him among his peers at this time. He was considered far, far leftist, extremely pro-woman. I mean, he was accepting of HD's bisexuality and polyamory, and would write to her and would talk to her about how this was not a negative feature of who they were. Like, that's so profound. And at the same time, like, there's a lot of mysticism that's engaged with between these two. And HD also meets another famous mystic and student of Freud at this time, Carl Jung. But her analysis of Carl Jung is extraordinarily scathing. She basically comes out as like, I have no time for his work. He's a student of the master, and I studied under the master. And she saw his entire movement as one driven by ego.
Wow.
And by this time, she was deeply kind of like pushing herself away from egoism and nationalism, because she saw so much negativity with Pound and what was going on with that movement in London, you know? And also at this time, she talks a lot about her extreme anxieties about World War II and the rising, like the potential of that coming about, you know? Hitler is talking about wanting to annex Austria, you know, and Freud is terrified. He feels like his family is going to be killed, you know, and right they are, right? So also at this time, Freud convinces HD to engage in sort of a very Greek thing. He asks her to recall her dreams and then compose them into poetry. But she takes it further. She composes an entire novel based upon her dreams and the discussions she has with Freud, called Bid Me to Live. And she sees this as in line with the psychotherapy and the methods of the divine Asclepius, you know, which our fans of our Greek studies will understand that in the Asclepian temples, part of their method for treating illness was to have people recall their dreams and then write poems and write stories based upon them. So both Freud and HD are deeply, deeply influenced by this at this time. And this is just a drawing that she drew while talking with Freud that I just wanted to include because it was cute. But go ahead.
I wonder if she would have met Edward Graham Howe, the psychoanalyst that I was really enamored with. He's from A Druid and Psychologist Clothing, because he was around, would have been in that area around this time, and he was very about integrating mysticism and spirituality into psychoanalysis.
I'll have to look into that, because her and Bryher were so connected to this movement. They corresponded with most people. Like, the most correspondence we have is with Freud and then with Anna Freud, but they were also talking with everyone who was involved in Bryher was a major funder of a lot of the early psychoanalysis movement. And then once the war breaks out, we'll get into this now, actually. So
perfect.
They recognized at this time in 1933, by going to Austria, just how intense and insane everything was. And Bryher published in her magazine, and this took up the vast majority of the magazine, which was an article called "What Shall You Do in the War?", which is basically a call to action to everyone in England to work to save the Jews and the liberals. She really identifies with the liberals more so in this paper, but I think that's just because she didn't see the full violence yet, you know? And it's also, she's trying to appeal to an audience which at this time would have held a fairly negative, unfortunately, opinion of Jewish people. Like, we have to remember, the vast majority of the world at this time is not pro-Jewish, you know? So she's really desperately trying to convince people to invest their money and work to save people. And she's pulling out all stops. And I just want to include this because I thought it was such a beautiful thing. And, well, we'll get to that, actually. So before we go into there, Bryher and HD, they wind up going back to their home in Geneva. And they stay in their home in Geneva until 1938. And Bryher spends a vast amount of her fortune. And she sets up an underground railroad network with a bunch of other anti-fascist people throughout Switzerland and throughout Germany and Austria. And she's accredited with rescuing well over 100 people. So many that it's not even documented. And many of whom would just stop over because her house was a specific stop on the underground railway network, and she would feed and clothe people. And it's estimated that she spent tens of millions of dollars.
Wow.
So I just really want to highlight that these two people, HD and Bryher, were deeply invested in these causes of fighting nationalism and fascism, and in helping and in trying to change the war, in their own way. Unlike Ezra Pound. So I wanted to contrast what was happening at the end of the war to HD with what happened at the end of the war to Ezra. So Ezra stays in Italy throughout World War II. And he's a diehard. He writes this famous book called Jefferson and/or Mussolini, where he outlines a lot of his economics and a lot of his more extreme views, where he believes that Mussolini is akin to Jefferson, and that Americans should really see Mussolini as a hero of the people and as bringing about this third Rome, this new idealized state. And just to put it to a lot of people want to defend Pound because he had a lot of Jewish friends. He had a lot of feminist friends, but I don't think there's really any defending him. I leave it up for everyone. I'm not saying that we cancel his art. I don't believe in cancelization. He's an incredibly important person, and I believe that you can find meaning in his art regardless. But he is a fascist. He is a racist and a nationalist, and he needs to be called so. And he held those beliefs his entire life. What ends up happening for people who understand the World War II history is that by 1939, or by near the end of the war, I'm not sure the exact numbers, but Mussolini is deposed, okay? And what ends up happening is Hitler organizes a raid to rescue Mussolini and extract him from mainland Italy. And they are successful. And they set up what's known as the Salo Republic, okay? So it's important we understand that Ezra had the opportunity to expatriate to the US at this time. He could have abandoned the fascist cause and returned home, okay? But he decided not to. He stuck with Mussolini and went to the Salo Republic and continued to write pro-fascist propaganda, okay? And this is a picture here on the left that was taken of him at the when he was sentenced, because he was sentenced, like all of the fascists and Nazis, under the Geneva Accord. But famously, the Americans who are running the whole thing, they took deep pity on Ezra, and they really didn't want to murder him, And we have some quotes of him at this time that the Americans used to basically say he was insane. So he talks about how he believed Hitler was a true man of the people and like a Christ type figure, and the same with Mussolini, and that their anti-Semitism was a mistake, and that it was largely propagated by outside forces who were greedy and wanted money for themselves, and that it was a large smear campaign to destroy the image of Hitler. Now, his lawyers were incredibly good because they used these comments to get him exonerated, get him to have the judge convinced that he was a crazy person, that someone who was a full-on narcissist, they said, and he believed that Hitler was a Christ figure. So rather than send him to jail, he gets put in a mental institution. And he stays in this mental institution for 12 years. And it breaks him. It breaks him, Many authors and artists go and visit Pound and argue on his behalf and try to get him released. HD never does so. She never visits Pound. She never talks to him again. After 12 years, a bunch of the artist's friends managed to get Ezra released because he's deemed as not a threat, but he never is able to have his power of attorney returned to him. So he's a ward of the state, and he winds up living out his life in the countryside of Italy, maintaining his views and largely being silent, you know? So I just wanted to include that to show you how far two people went in their political kind of changes. HD embraces leftism and embraces radical feminism and devotes her time and money to rescuing people, whereas Ezra devotes himself entirely to fascism. And it's sad, but it's the reality. So after the war, HD's completely shattered. Okay. World War I broke her with the loss of her father, the loss of her brother, the loss of her mother, and a miscarriage. By the end of World War II now, she's seen the death of countless people, countless personal friends and acquaintances, because she was deeply connected to the Austrian liberal scene at this time, and it deeply, deeply affected her. So she wrote this book called Trilogy, which contains a lot of her reflections on the war. And she also wrote this book, a memoir of her reaction to Pound, called An End to Torment. And it's really an enlightening read, because she talks about how she believes that Pound becomes possessed by an egregore, basically, and gets taken in by the magic of fascism. And really, she believed he sold his soul to that idea of the Third Rome. And that's what fundamentally killed him, And she does not defend him in this book by any means. She does defend the man she knew in early life, but not the man he became. So at this time, this is a picture of her in her 60s. I wanted to include. This is I just love this portrait. This was taken by her daughter. And at this time, she starts writing a book called Helen in Egypt. So after World War II, she kind of like I said, she had this deep mental breakdown, right? And her and Bryher even, they don't fully separate, but they're no longer deeply connected like they once were. Specifically, HD becomes hugely involved in the occult and in magic. And Bryher is just not really interested, they are to a point, but they don't really, I don't feel like Bryher is as well read or as deeply involved in a lot of this as HD is. And there's a deep skepticism that runs through all of HD's work, but she's fundamentally a mystic and is really engaged in mysticism at this time. And she's also, let me just check my notes here. So this is 1952 when she publishes Helen in Egypt, by the time it's finished. But throughout this time, she's studying with the psychoanalyst Eric Haid, and is really confronting her sexuality at this time. And she does a series of rituals and rites to invoke this spirit, this idea of Helen and of Achilles. And she really believes that Helen in her, it's like she is a reincarnation of Helen. And she believes that she has, like, the story of Helen in Egypt is sort of a truth. And she believes like it really did happen, may not in this dimension, maybe in another dimension, but this is a true tale of Helen and the ending of her story. She imagines that Helen gets shipwrecked along with Achilles in Egypt, and they go on like a radical kind of adventure. It's one of her longest poems, and it's deeply occult, and it's filled with a lot of like really hard to process imagery. And unfortunately, because of this, it doesn't really get read a lot. And a lot of people don't know how to understand it or make of it. But she reads from this, and I had showed you some of her reading. So I'm gonna, it's only about 3 minutes, but we'll give it a listen here. So let me just pull this up 1 second. So add that. Okay, perfect.
Helen is, of course, that Helen of Sparta, Helen of Troy, Helena hated of Greece. In a dream or trance, she left Troy. She finds herself in Egypt. How? Why? She does not know until the image of a lost and shipwrecked Achilles appears. Few were the words we said, nor knew each other, nor asked, are you spirit? Are you sister? Are you brother? Are you alive? Are you dead? The harpers will sing forever of how Achilles met Helen among the shades. But we were not. We are not shadows. As we walk heel and sole, leave our sandal prints in the sand. Though the wound that healed treads lightly, more lightly follow the purple sandal. Then Helen tries to disguise herself, to hide from Achilles, but she does not see. He recognizes her. How could I hide my eyes? How could I veil my face? With ash or charcoal from the embers. I drew out a blackened stick, but he snatched it. He flung it back. What sort of enchantment is this? What art will you yield with a faggot? Are you Hecate? Are you a witch? A vulture? A hieroglyph? The sign or the name for God? What sort of goddess is this? Where are we? Who are you? Where is this desolate coast? Who am I? Am I a ghost? You are living, O child of Thetis, as you never lived before. Then he caught at my wrist, Helen, accursed of Greece. I have seen you upon the ramparts. No art is beneath your power. You stole the chosen, the flower of all time, of all history. My children, my legion. For you were the ships burnt. O cursed, O envious Isis, you a vulture, a hieroglyph. Zeus be my witness, I said. It was he, Ahmed, dreamed of all this phantasmagoria of Troy. It was dream and a fantasy. Oh, Thetis, oh, sea mother, I pray that you touch my throat with your fingers remorseless. You let me go on. Let me. Oh, Thetis, oh, sea mother, I prayed under his cloak. Let me remember forever this star in the night.
Wow, eh?
Beautiful.
Unfortunately, the subtitles weren't accurate. I mean, I included them just because they kind of help you a bit. You know, like they screwed up Hecate and they screwed up Achilles.
YouTube subtitles are always a bit more of a guide than on, you know.
Right. So I highly suggest that people go in and read this book because it's just it really unveils a lot of the mystery. And I really want to get into just how much of a wizard HD becomes at this time, because it's kind of intense and truly profound. And I'm super like enamored and just in awe of the occult studies that she does. So she really gets involved in the French scene and reads a lot of books. And we have a lot of her writings, so we know, and we have her library, so we know what she's reading. And these are two of the most important books that she was connected to. This one is called Le Tarot Traditionnel, and this is by Jean Charbosseau. And he was a French Rosicrucian and Martinist, a very famous writer at the time. And this is not just like a normal guide to the tarot. This is a very much a hermetic and alchemical text. And it also differentiates between hermeticism and alchemy, like very deep, deep stuff. And then this collection here, The Cults of the Greek States, this is a 3-volume work. And in HD's personal copy, it's like shredded. She's writing on like every other pages of these volumes. This is something that she read throughout her entire life and deeply impacted her. And she was especially involved with the Sparta and Helen, and was really invested in those stories. But here's a quote that I took from The Tarot by Charbonneau, or Chaboseau, or Chaboseau, sorry, Chaboseau. And this is regarding the devil card, just to show you how intense the occultism and how advanced this is. It says, and she had personally underlined this passage, so we know that this meant a lot to her. It says, the devil renders more precise this transcendental teaching on revelation. The attribution of this arcanum to the devil veils a profound mystery, the very mystery of Lucifer, the light bringer, opposed to Satan, the teacher who came from Venus, who teaches people traditional art and science, is the secret that the dogma of the Western religions have hidden under the sham and reprobation inherent in evil and its agents. It is, however, impossible to elaborate on this question, but suffice it to say that inspiration and illumination are the properties that dispense the revelation of the real nature of Lucifer. But doubtless I've said too much, lest people treat me like a Satanist. Still, the analogy of the goat of Mendes and the Baphomet of the Templars will be need to exonerate me. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. So she really identified with this understanding of Lucifer as the light bringer, as Apollo, as the opposite of Satan. And she saw Satan as representative, and she writes this in her books, of Dionysus. Okay? So it's really interesting because a lot of people make this connection where Dionysus is the chthonic inversion of Lucifer, you know, and she felt that it was her duty to connect to this Luciferian side. And she had a ton of this kind of French Luciferian literature. And while she didn't openly identify with it, she writes about it a ton. And also this image of the goat of Mendes and the Baphomet and the Templars become a central part of her magical study and her personal mythology that she develops, where she connects the Baphomet with this idea of the cosmogonic eros, or what they call in the Orphic, the Faunes, the divine hermaphrodite. And she felt that it was a part of the mystery to reform and create the divine hermaphrodite, right? And she believed that the way to do that was through the mysteries of Lucifer, Diana, and that they were the ones who showed the way, basically. So about as occult as you get.
Yes.
So this is another writer that she was deeply, deeply, heavily invested in. He was also a Martinist and a Rosicrucian occultist. This is Robert Ambelain. He also wrote a lot about Jewish mysticism, which HD was heavily invested in because she felt that the persecution of Judaism was also a part of the persecution of the Great Mother. And she felt that much of what the Nazis were doing was a grand sacrifice. You know, it wasn't lost on her that this word, the Holocaust, has etymology in the sacrifice. And she felt that they were killing queer people, Jewish people, women, and dissidents as a way to create their third Rome, you know? And so as a result of this, she becomes heavily, heavily involved in Jewish mysticism and has a deep love for this. Also brought on by the master, her guru, Sigmund Freud, who, as we know, was born into Hasidism. And while he did not write a lot about this, they spoke deeply together about mysticism from a Jewish perspective, you know? And so she incorporates the Kabbalah into all of her magic, into how she sees the world. And also this book about cathedrals and trying to find the true mystery of the Christian religion. Because again, she felt that Christianity was a corruption of these same divine mysteries. And she felt that her own Moravian church was more deeply connected to this. And she, in her writings, identifies the Mother Mary with the divine virgin Artemis Diana, you know? So a lot of the stuff that we talk about on here, she's doing in the 1950s. So these are two books that she writes during this period of her life, this decade between 1950 and 1960. So one is HD, it's Vale Ave, which means farewell, hail. And this is her most, what I would call like Luciferian kind of writing, her most radical writing. It's a poem to Eros, but it's Eros, the cosmogonic Eros, the Eros that is Phanes, the divine hermaphrodite. This is not the Cupid that we know, you know, like that little cherub you see. And the Hermetic definition wasn't released till after her death, but it's a collection of all of the various poems and magical workings she releases at this time. And it's very, very deep, profound work, but very dense. And like a lot of people have trouble penetrating this work. Like you really need to have an understanding of the Greek tradition, Kabbalah, and Martinism as understood by Anne Boleyn to pierce what she's getting at. She purposely occludes a lot of this stuff. It's also important that we understand, like, Anne Boleyn, like, she was aware of Crowley, but she thought Crowley was a corrupter and an egoist, the same way she describes Carl Jung. And she felt that Crowley was ripping off a lot of the French occultists, and especially Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn famously also writes a book. So Crowley, one of his more famous works is trying to perform a very important rite that originates actually in Jewish mysticism, but it incorporates a lot of neo-pagan thought. It's called the rites of Abramelin the Mage, okay? And people who are invested in occultism, this should ring some serious bells, because this rite is all about connecting to what Crowley termed the holy guardian angel or the higher self. And Abramelin in this work believed that it was the fulfillment of the great work, right? Which is this healing of the wounds of separation and the recreation of Eros or Baphomet or Phanes, you know? And she, in the last part of her life, actually engaged in this rite. So it's uncertain if she completed it, but there's a lot of writings about it. So I tend to believe that she actually completed the full rite of Abramelin the Mage, which Crowley never was able to do. Okay, so put that in perspective there. So here also, I wanted to just show you some of her writings. She really connected to this idea of Anne Boleyn talks about initiation. And he has two types of initiation, an astral initiation and an initiation of the double. And he saw these as two separate forms of the self. And I thought this idea of the double really familiar because it really connected me to the works of Antonin Artaud. And I just wanted could you talk about Antonin Artaud's idea of the double, Graham?
Yeah, so the double is with Artaud is very multifaceted, but from a theater perspective, from a life perspective, is the sense that there are sacred symbols and icons and concepts that are at always at cosmic work, and then there are sort of like the double. So like, for example, in theater, there's the actors on stage, but the costumes that they're wearing symbolize like greater concepts and greater powers, and those are having their own dialogue at the same time that the actors are performing on stage. Would be a good way to describe the double.
Right? So she saw this kind of doubling happening in the world, and she saw the world itself as a theater, basically. And she describes how you have to create an alternative version of the self, an idealized form of the self. And that is the self that gets projected through the initiations that you become. This is your double or your holy guardian angel, right? And to do this, you have to enter into the astral. You have to engage with the Akashic records and go through initiation. And she believed that she went through the rites of Eleusis. And she writes about this, but astrally. And there's a really amazing book about this that I recommend everyone read called The Astral HD, where she actually even meets up with some of her occulted heroes like Anne Boleyn and others and formally identifies herself with them. And they become part of her double, this idealized form of self that is so important in this rite of Abramelin the Mage and the great work, which becomes so defining of the last half of her life. So I wanted to include this. This is her writing about the Eleusinian mysteries, but the astral version that she goes through. So she says, the first stage of initiation requires that one develop a normal, healthy body. A candidate for the second stage is able to look into things with his or her intellect, sheer brain. So this is that reason, that rationality. And she would connect this to the Lucifer. So the first step is to build up yourself and to connect and know the body. And then the second step is to apply reason and to engage with reason to the point where reason can no longer provide you the truth. It starts to break down. So she goes on, one cannot skip stages, for one must understand slower wisdom before one understands a higher. Those spirits of a higher world have access into a lower world. The third stage involves the development of an overmind with super feelings, which would help bring about the development of the entire human race. If possessed of the right sort of brains, 2 or 3 people gathered together in the name of truth, beauty, overmind consciousness could bring the whole force of this power back into the world. In a world of billions, then, it would only take a very few spiritually developed people to turn the whole tide of human thought. And she believed that this was the role of the poet, to engage with the mystery and to become a funnel, become a double of the entirety of society and to drive it forward, to create that other that forces radical change, that idealized self, right? That's both painful and disgusting, but also beautiful, that we have to evolve into, you know? And this becomes a divining thing of her. Exactly, right? So Artaud. And this is what I mean, like, even though they're coming at this from different points, she's coming from poetry and occultism, and Artaud's coming from theater and surrealism.
He ends up approaching it from these perspectives as well, which is really interesting. Like his concept of the double is very... People write whole essays and books on it.
No, you're right. I shouldn't.
Yeah, it's very different. This is a slightly different angle, though, than the theater angle.
Yeah, exactly. I just mean slightly different lens, but they're coming to very similar conclusions. And I imagine that Artaud is reading a lot of the same work, or at least people who are aware of the same work, because she's so involved in the French occult scene at this time, you know?
Yeah.
So this is another quote I wanted to include from one of her novels that she wrote under a pseudonym. And this is talking about the serpent goddess. So for those of you who are aware, this was in result to, there was a famous discovery on the island of Crete where they found the Bronze Age Minoan civilization that predates the Mycenaean civilization. And they find this statue that becomes known as the serpent goddess. And it's a famous figure of this woman in a long dress with her breasts exposed, and she's holding up 2 snakes. HD heavily identified with this and felt like when this discovery was made that it was one of the most profound discoveries of the modern world, and it was going to transform society. And she believed that this serpent was the serpent goddess was the oldest form of the great mother that she worshipped and that she found throughout the Greek mysteries. So she writes here, we cannot dismiss the serpent goddess from the citadel. She has been there too long. It was not only the Delphinian dolphin, Apollo, who came from the cradle of Zeus. His sister came with him. Athens, like Troy, Mycenae, and Delphi, was a Cretan colony. But shall our goddess be swept to oblivion? We will arm her, and we will arm the youth of her city. again, she really identifies with this Greek idea of the polis, of society as a polis, and this use of magic and poetry and tragedy of revitalizing the polis or the double, right? And she believes that it was her duty to defend the divine feminine, to protect this with love. So one of the interesting things too with HD is she talks a lot about the power of love and investing in love, but she does not mean a pacifist love, okay? She means a love in the truly Aphroditean sense, with all its passion and all of its anger. You know, she heavily identifies with figures like Circe and Medea, who she sees as loving characters who have a righteous, loving anger, you know? And she believed it was important that we engage in this, you know? And this was a quote just to show her view and how tuned in she was. So for those with ears to hear, you'll recognize a lot of these figures that Ammon and others have identified with Lady Babylon and the Great Mother. An invisible Circe, or disguised Lilith, or Helen, or Guinevere, or Semiramis, that's the Queen of Babylon, that we invoke as graces, even virtues, not for their beauty alone, but for their impeccable search, their incapable search, for the semblable, the haunting first cause, the primum mobile that gave both hell and paradise to Dante, Vale Ave. And she identifies that phrase, Vale Ave, with the Alpha and the Omega of Greek. She didn't want to say Alpha and Omega because that had been corrupted by the Christian mysteries. You know, so she interprets it in her own way. And she believes like this connection with the goddess, it's the beginning and the end, right? She's both the womb and the force that shows us how to heal the wounds of separation and return back to the one. And this was just a quote from a book on Kabbalah that was talking about HD and the Kabbalah that I thought was really profound. It says, all these names are connected in HD's calculations with the Grand Mare, or Great Mother, the aspect of God that emanates from the third Sephirah, Binah, which she felt was like the most important of the Trinity, the most direct and accessible was this Diana, the feminine side. You know, she believed that you have the one which gives birth to that cosmogonic eros that then separates out into the Trinity. And this is a Trinity of the divine feminine, right? Kind of representative by Hecate, which she talks about as this force of reason, rectitude, and justice. It's really profound stuff. And it also connects to the works of like Christine de Pizan and the Book of the City of Ladies, which was arguably one of the earliest pieces of feminist literature. So this is a passage I wanted to read to you guys. It comes from the ending of her epic poem, Vale Ave. It says, yet still this Trinity sends out its message. Through the winter dark, arise, arise, reanimate, O spirit, this small ark, this little body, this small separate self of the world's mortals. Make but one immortal, let but one awake, to set the dead pyre flaming, that the phoenix, Venus, Mercury may fire the world with ecstasy, with love who forgets our faults, with love who redeems the loss, with love, 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 unique.
Amazing.
And I want people to notice that the use of doubles is important here. Arise, arise, Venus, Venus, okay? This is, again, that doubling. You want to become the Venus. You want to arise, so you have to do that in the immediate self and in the future projected self. So HD winds up dying of old age. They don't really list a cause. She dies in her bed alone in Zurich Switzerland. This is her death mask. And she passes away in 1961. She was still deeply in love and connected to Bryher. And Bryher had her tombstone made and included these lines, which are from an earlier poem that she wrote called Epigraph. And the lines go, "So you may say, Greek flower, Greek ecstasy, reclaims forever one who died, following intricate songs, lost measure."
Beautiful.
So she felt, and Bryher felt, that it was their job to bring back the Greek mysteries and the Greek thought and this philosophy back to the world. You know, she made that her life's mission and embodied that in every way. You know, she was fluent in the Greek. She traveled in Greece. She practiced all kinds of magic. And she did not just practice a traditional form of Greek paganism. She was all about projecting into the future in a new incorporation and evolution. You know, she's truly a radical of her time. So that was the presentation. I'm just going to I wanted to go over a few of her poems now, some of my favorites. Did you have any thoughts before we get into the poetry, just on her life, and what do you make of HT?
I mean, it's a lot to absorb, but a very interesting, enriched life, it would appear that she lived.
Right?
In spite of everything, she truly followed her will, and also like her sense of love. I think that's really what guided a lot of her life, from what I've interpreted out of this.
Very much so. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because it's her life that's kind of the most famous aspect of her in the modern times. You know, she's become a queer icon, one of the earliest people who practiced polyamory openly, who advocated for these things like bisexuality, polyamory. She's a magician of the highest art, so she's really well loved in certain circles, and among feminists and the queer people, she's very much an icon, So let's get into some of her work here. So this is one of her most famous poems, and it's one that tends to generate a ton of controversy. So this is on Helen, the figure she identified with most. So here we go. Helen, all Greece hates, the still eyes in the white face, the luster as of olives where she stands in the white hands. All Greece reviles, the wan face when she smiles, hating it deeper still when it grows wan and white, remembering past enchantments and past ills. Greece sees unmoved God's daughter, born of love, the beauty of cool feet, and slenderest knees, could love indeed the maid, only if she were laid white ash among funeral cypresses.
Ooh.
So HD really felt that people hated femininity. They hated beauty. They wanted to possess it, and they want it in a selfish way. They completely otherize the woman and do not connect with her at all. And out of this inability to comprehend and this sheer obsession with the beauty, have to destroy it. They can't allow it to be. It has to be reduced to flames and ashes. And she felt that it was her duty to embody this figure of the divine feminine, to become that other that challenges people and forces them to confront. And she felt it was important too that men recognize this and recognize how they treat the idealized female form, how they reduce it and how they lust after it, how their obsession with this beauty and this elevation of the beauty ultimately results in its destruction every time. And also she saw Helen as a very profound figure, as someone who refused to reject her own beauty, okay? As someone who doesn't like want to be killed, but refuses to kowtow and is destroyed. So she feels like with a lot of these Venusian women, they're destroyed not only because of their beauty, but because of their unwillingness to compromise their individuality or their will to others. And even though they're destroyed, it's that act of desecration that ultimately brings about their will to fruition. She saw Helen and the destruction of Helen as a force that shone a light on this violence of women, and as a force of beauty, and as a force of release and empowerment for women. You know, she really saw this not as a passive action, okay, but as a profound action of self, of walking into the flames, refusing to kowtow, okay? And I want people to recognize it in that lens, because I've shared this poem before and people have reacted very negatively, you know? Because again, she's trying to depict how Greece viewed Helen, not how we should view Helen, right?
Right.
So this is one of her earliest poems and is a really one deep in the mystery for those with ears to hear. This has to deal with Priapus, who is the god of the orchard, god of fruit, but is also the god of the erection. He's famous for having a massive penis and for guarding the gardens, right? And for being this important force within the mystery. So I'll read here. Priapus, keeper of orchards, I saw the first pear as it fell, the honey-seeking, golden banded, the yellow swarm, was not more fleet than I. Spare us from loveliness. And I fell prostrate, crying, Thou hast flayed us with thy blossoms. Spare us the beauty of fruit trees. The honey-seeking paused not. The air thundered their song, and I was alone. I alone was prostrate. O rough-hewn god of the orchard, I bring thee an offering. Do thou, alone unbeautiful, son of the god, spare us from loveliness.
Wow.
So she really connected this poem to the story of Eve, okay? And she saw Priapus as kind of representative of that serpent who, by bestowing the fruit upon Eve, is giving her beauty, is giving her loveliness. And it's this loveliness that's paradoxical, because while it is powerful, it otherizes her. It makes her that object of desire that people want to destroy, you
Something
know?
careful and own.
Exactly. So it's this juxtaposition. Do you become the beautiful? Do you eat of the fruit? Do you engage in the mystery and transform the self? To do so is to engage in the ire of everyone else and to become that object of desire, you know, and to ultimately be sacrificed, you know. Very, very powerful stuff. This is another one of her shorter poems that has to do with the mystery. Again, with those with ears to hear, you'll recognize the symbols of the stars, the wheel, the ship steering wheel, and of course the holy purple. So stars wheel in purple. Yours is not so rare as Hesperus, nor yet so great a star as bright Aldebaran or Sirius, yet not the strained and brilliant one of war. Stars turn in purple, glorious to the sight. Yours is not gracious as the Pleiades are, nor as Orion's sapphires luminous, yet disenchanted, cold, imperious face, when all the others blighted reel and fall. Your star, steel set, keeps lone in frigid trysts, to frighten ships, baffled in wind and blast. And those of us who know our astronomy will recognize that she's talking about the evening and the morning star, Venus, okay? This is the most important star for guiding the ships. So, very powerful stuff. Here's another one regarding the mysteries directly that I really liked. It says, the mysteries remain. The mysteries remain. I keep the same. Cycle of seed time and of sun and rain. Demeter in the grass I multiply. Renew and bless. Bacchus in the vine. I hold the law. I keep the mysteries true. The first of these to name the living dead. I am the wine and bread. I keep the law. I hold the mysteries true. I am the vine, the branches, you and you. What do you think of that, Graham?
There's a lot to pick up in here. I mean, I am the vine, I'm kind of like Dionysus, like the god of wine. I am the wine and bread. That's almost like a Christ sort of invocation there. But takes her own interpretation of it, though, obviously.
Right?
And I'm the vine, the branches, you and you. That's kind of like the all and everything is what I'm seeing there.
You got it. So the purpose of the mysteries was to experience the pan, right? The all. It was also to go through this process of death and rebirth. So the first step of the mystery is to die, and she calls it out, right? And it's to be reborn. It's one of the most succinct, complete view of the Eleusinian mysteries I've ever seen. And it's one of my all-time favorite poems.
It's beautiful.
So this poem is Circe. This one is another one of her most famous. And I think that those of us who are friends with Amen and who love the Lady Babylon work will really connect to this poem. It's a bit of a longer one, so bear with my reading. It says, "It was easy enough to bend them to my wish. It was easy enough to alter them with a touch. But you, adrift on the great sea, how shall I call you back? Cedar and white ash, rock cedar and sand plants, and tamarisk, red cedar and white cedar and black cedar from the inmost forest. Fragrance upon fragrance, and all of my sea magic is for naught. It was easy enough. A thought called them from the sharp edges of the earth. They prayed for a touch. They cried for the sight of my face. They entered me, till in pity I turned each to his own self. Panther and panther, then a black leopard follows close. Panther and red, a great hound, a godlike beast, cut the sand in a clear ring and shut me from the earth and cover the sea sound with their throats and the sea roar with their own barks and bellowing and snarls and the sea stars and the swirl of the sands and the rock tamarisk and the wind resonance and not your voice. It is easy enough to call men from the edges of the earth. It is easy enough to summon them to my feet with a thought. It's as beautiful to see the tall panther, the sleek deerhounds circle in the dark. It is easy enough to make cedar and white ash fumes into palaces and to cover the sea caves with ivory and onyx. But I would give up rock fringes of coral in the inmost chamber of my island palace and my own gifts and the whole region of my power and my magic for your glance."
Ooh.
What do you make of that? Are you familiar with the story of Circe?
Not overly, no.
So Circe is a empress, witch kind of queen figure that's a very prominent in the Odyssey. She rules over the island kingdom, and famously, Odysseus crashes on her shore.
Did he who turns his crew into pigs?
Yes, but not just pigs, all kinds of animals.
Yeah,
Most
all kinds of
turns them
animals.
to their true forms.
Famously pigs, but yeah, many other animals as well. Okay,
Most
yeah,
of
it's
them
been a while
pigs.
since I read the Odyssey, but yeah.
It's a long read. It's a hard read. I've read large chunks of it. And I've read a lot of summaries and different adaptations of it. So, like
Right.
I read Ulysses by James Joyce. So,
Yeah, of course.
but what we can see here is that she's talking about all of her magic power that can work on all the other men, but doesn't seem to affect the divine Odysseus, who refuses to bend the knee to her, who is on his own mission, and no amount of magic she throws at him will work. But for those with ears to hear, you'll see there are recipes for incense in here, okay? And there's some deep, powerful magic going on. And it's also important that she identifies that Circe she could have destroyed Odysseus, but she loves him. She wants Odysseus to choose her, but he doesn't, okay? And this is kind of the tragedy of Circe, So a very deep kind of view of Circe that we don't normally see as a tragic figure who loses this love. Normally, she's this powerful witch queen who, while she doesn't get to take Odysseus, she does have a love affair with him, and then he takes off, and she does help him go to the underworld, and then isn't really mentioned again all that much. So,
no, it's true.
Really, really, I love that poem, and it's one of her most famous. Okay, so this is a longer poem again. But this is one of my favorites, and it's another one of these mythological feminine characters. This is called Eurydice. Oh, but sorry, before we get into that, did you have any other words about the previous poem?
Nope.
Okay.
We're good.
Awesome. Sorry, I'm going so fast. I want to make sure.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, it's okay.
Love it. Okay. So this is Eurydice. So you have swept me back. I who could have walked with the live souls above the earth. I who could have slept among the live flowers at last. So for your arrogance and your ruthlessness, I am swept back, where dead lichens drip, dead cinders upon moss of ash. So for your arrogance, I am broken at last. I who have lived unconscious, who was almost forgot. If you had let me wait, had I grown from listlessness into peace, if you had let me rest with the dead, I had forgot you and the past. Here, only flame upon flame and black among the red sparks, streaks of black and light, grown colorless. Why did you turn back? That hell should be re-inhabited of myself thus, swept into nothingness. Why did you glance back? Why did you hesitate for that moment? Why did you bend your face, caught with the flame of the upper earth above my face? Was it that crossed my face with the light from yours and your glances? Was it you saw in my face the light of your own face, the fire of your own presence? What had my face to offer but the reflex of the earth, hyacinth color, caught from the raw fissure in the rock, where the light struck, and the color of azure crocuses, and the bright surface of gold crocuses, and of the wind flower, swift in its veins as lightning and as white. Saffron from the fringes of the earth, wild saffron that has bent over the sharp edge of the earth, all the flowers that cut through the earth. All the flowers are lost. Everything is lost. Everything is crossed with black, black upon black, and worse than black, this colorless night or light. Fringe upon fringe of blue crocuses, crocuses walled against blue of themselves, blue of that upper earth, blue of the depth upon depth of flowers lost. Flowers, if I could have taken once my breath of them, enough of them, more than earth, even then of the upper earth, had passed with me beneath the earth. If I could have caught up from the earth the whole of the flowers of the earth, if once I could have breathed into myself the very golden crocuses and the red, and the very golden hearts of the first saffron, the whole of the golden mass, the whole of the great fragrance, I could have dared the loss. So for your arrogance and your ruthlessness, I have lost the earth and the flowers of the earth and the live souls above the earth, and you who passed across this life and reached ruthless, you who have your own light, who are to yourself a presence, who need no presence, yet for all your arrogance in your glance I tell you this, such loss is no loss. Such terror, such coils and strands and pitfalls of blackness, such terror is no loss. Hell is no worse than your earth. Above the earth, hell is no worse. No, nor your flowers, nor your veins of light, nor your presence a loss. My hell is no worse than yours, though you pass among the flowers and speak with the spirits above the earth.
Oh.
Pretty wild, eh? Are you familiar with the story of Eurydice?
Only a little bit. You know, I studied a lot of this stuff in university, but that was like 10, 15 years ago.
Oh, no worries. Yeah. So Eurydice is the wife of Orpheus. And Orpheus
Yeah.
he is considered one of the greatest philosophers. He founds Orphism, which is one of the holy divine mysteries. But he's also one of the Argonauts. He famously travels with Jason. And his wife Eurydice dies. And this is about how he goes to Hades to bring her back.
And he's not supposed to look back, but he does. No. Yeah.
Because what happens is his music is so profound, it moves Pluton, okay? Or you know, the god of the underworld, that Dionysus of death. It moves to say, okay, because of your music, I will allow you to bring Eurydice back. But if you falter, if you doubt, you know, she will have to stay with me for eternity. So by doing this, he damns the feminine. He damns Eurydice, you know? And Eurydice here, like, this is so wild to hear it from her perspective because she rebukes him. I died. I was in the peace and the quiet of the black. I had forgotten the joys of the living. And what did you do? You reminded me of love. You reminded me of all that was lost, only to doubt me, only to doubt that I would follow you, only to look back when you knew that would destroy me, you know? And he damns her. His obsession with her and his desire to possess her damns her to the darkness, you know? And this is really important because after this, Orpheus never engages in love of a woman again. And when he brings back the mystery, it's not the Hieros Gamos that we know from the Median tradition, which is the uniting of male and female. Now it becomes the uniting of male and male. And it radically changes things. And this is where a lot of people believe the corruption inherent in the Greek mystery begins. This rejection of the female. And HD is acknowledging this. HD is seeing that this Orphic tradition, this masculine tradition that, just like we saw in the previous poem about Helen, is about trying to possess the woman as an object of beauty for their own desire, for their own pleasure, disregarding the other's individuality and personhood, disregarding her life, you know, because in the Greek tradition, they believe in reincarnation. If Eurydice was left alone, she would be reborn again upon the earth and get to smell the flowers. But now she is doomed because of Orpheus's hubris. And this eventually leads to Orpheus's death. He becomes ripped apart at the hands of the Maenads, the female divine followers of Dionysus, and his head becomes transformed into an oracle, you know, so he suffers for this abuse too. Pretty cool poem though, eh?
Oh, I love it. It's very...
Sorry. Go ahead.
It's a bit scathing towards Orpheus, you know?
But what I love about this is that...
With reason, though.
Right? And we got to understand that a lot of the people, there's very few people writing from a female perspective regarding the myths prior to HD. And not like this. Not in this scathing poetic form for all to see. You know what I mean?
Right.
So... Oh, sorry, there's more here. I forgot. It keeps going. There's one more passage here. Okay. Against the black, I have more fervor than you and all the splendor of that place. Against the blackness and the stark gray, I have more light. And the flowers, if I should tell you, would turn from your own fit's path toward hell. Turn again and glance back, and I would sink into a place even more terrible than this. At least I have the flowers of myself and my thoughts. No God can take that. I have the fervor of myself for a presence, and my own spirit for light. And my own spirit with its loss knows this. Though small against the black, small against the formless rocks, hell must break before I am lost. Before I am lost, hell must open like a red rose for the dead to pass.
Wow.
And I want people to recognize in these last lines, she's identifying Eurydice with the divine virgin Artemis, okay? The one who spurns love and is unto herself, right? And it's important that it's always these Dianic figures, these women unto themselves who engage in the sacrifice, who purposely walk through the fires because they refuse to be made lesser, to be second to the men and to anyone else. They stand firm, you know, and that's what it means to be this Dianic figure, to be true to oneself. It's not so much about spurning love, it's rejecting of that masculine love. And it's that finding love in the self, the completeness of your ownness, and rallying against the violence and the rape of men, you know? And this is a very powerful thing, especially in the ancient times and still to this day. And it's why it's such a powerful feminist and magical image, you know? So that's the last poem I had, and that completes our deep dive into HD. So what's your overall takeaway?
My overall takeaway, a fascinating human. I want to read more of her work.
Right? I really, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to say, it really makes me want to engage a lot more with her later work, because so much of it I'm not even familiar. Like I read portions of Vale Ave. It's out of print. Or it is in print, but it's not on digital. I would have to order one in. And then
Probably
like, exactly. And then her hermetic definitions is also very expensive, but it's something I intend to do and engage with because it's just such profound literature. And, you know, she's such an amazing figure, someone who really embodies, I feel, this Dianic energy, this powerful divine feminine, and engaged with life and the mysteries in her own individualistic way. You know, she never submitted to anyone else, even though she was an occultist. She was never a Greco-Roman occultist or pagan. She was never a Moravian Christian. Never a Luciferian. What?
She never ascribed to a single thought.
No, and anytime anything was ascribed, it was placed upon her, like imagist. She never even called her poetry, which inspired the entire bloody movement, imagist, you know? And she always rebelled. She's like, I don't want to be Ezra Pound's muse. I want to be my muse. I want to transform the world, you know? I don't want to just be an other. But also she wants to embody that other in that fierce, defining way to challenge everyone. And she does this in so many ways. She was bisexual. She was polyamorous. She was feminist. She was anti-fascist. It's hard to stress how radical those concepts are in the freaking 1940s and 50s and even earlier, 1910s and 20s. Like,
yeah.
A defining person of her generation, and I believe one of the most important magical figures, and why I wanted to bring her to Searching for Dragons.
I think it was a perfect choice.
Amazing. So thank you all for coming in and listening to our discussion on HD. I hope you all like and subscribe. And make sure you go below and support Graham. We have links to all of his music and to his books. And next week, we'll be getting back together and we're going to be delving into another important figure from a similar time period, one of the defining people of the modernist movement, Charles Baudelaire.
Can't wait for that one.
Yeah, this one I'm excited about because Ammon has talked a lot about, Baudelaire, and our friend Gandhi did the hard work of translating and scanning the entire work, Flowers of Evil. So I'm going to be reading that. And we're mostly going to be focusing on that specific work just because it's so deep. And it's so hard, like you see, to try and cover these magician artists their entire career.
It's so difficult. It's best to choose like a couple works and sort of really deep dive into those and explore their imagery. But they have so much to say,
Right?
that you can't cover it all.
No, I felt it was important though that we talk about HD's life, since her life is so radical and isn't so important to her work. And I really wanted to go through that. But yeah, so next week we'll be doing Charles Baudelaire, and then the following, hopefully, if everything works out, we're going to be doing Graham's choice, which is the French artist
from Luxembourg, Gas Boucher.
And yeah, can you talk briefly about Gash Boucher?
So he's a contemporary artist, still alive today, and he was very prominent in the art scene, and then became sort of frustrated with, he would talk to other artists about magic, and they would just like,
Right.
And he became very frustrated with that, and that paired with a back injury, he retreated sort of from society into the Ardennes, and he performs Saturnian and Negrito alchemy, and incorporates that into his sculpture and his paintings and his writing.
That's profound. And that's heavily relates to what we're talking about here, because, the Saturnian tradition is that ancient Bronze Age agricultural Greek tradition, right? That's that it's been vilified within the Christian context and within modernity. But, there's a lot more to this. And I'm excited to dig into Gast's work and to really explore his take on alchemy and Saturnian magic. So please tune in next week, or please tune in the next couple weeks for these upcoming episodes, and it's only going to get more exciting from there. We have a huge list of amazing figures that we hope to get into. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. Again, like, subscribe, share. Do you have any last words for the audience today?
Just, live your best life, be in touch with yourself. Don't compromise yourself for anyone.
Right? Especially you who identify as women or who are born women, take pride in yourself. And even though it's beauty and it's femininity, there can be a fierce individuality and power in that. There is power in the soft ways of women that people do not recognize or understand. Action and violence and power don't necessarily have to be in a direct, overt, masculine way, and HD embodies that, Helen embodies that, Diana embodies that, and there is a fierce violence there too, don't negate that either, but don't ever think that these beautiful figures are objects to be possessed. These are people, profound images, holy, who need to be perceived and understood. And it's that process of understanding the other that's so central to the mystery. So that's how we'll end it for today. So peace and love, and hail Satan. Thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, this is Searching for Dragons.